Selwyn Cornish. He's written extensively on Australia's economic and history, including the RBA and how it all works. Thanks very much for your time. I guess we'll focus first of all on the actual performance of the RBA. It was very bullish. Philip Lowe was very bullish that inflation, the sort of inflationary pressures we were seeing early on in the US would not happen in Australia. That was clearly wrong. Should there have been a bit more wariness of that happening in Australia?
Well, the RBA has been a very successful institution for most of the time since the early 1990s. We didn't have a recession for almost 30 years, which is a world record. Coming into the COVID, the bank, like just about every other central bank, did not meet its inflation target. But of course, the COVID experience was a very unusual one. It's been 100 years since the previous pandemic, and I think some of the criticism has not been very accurate, criticism of the Reserve Bank. One has to look at its performance over a period of time, I think.
So let's go to some of that criticism then and get your view on it. If you look at performances of banks, central banks during COVID, you're right, a lot got in this tricky position where they were supporting economies and then all the money pumped out, not just through the actions of the RBA, but actions of governments, really took hold in inflation. What the RBA did have, though, was a bit of a warning, a bit of a canary in the coal mine via the US. I know it's easy in hindsight, but we are in hindsight now. Should they have taken more notice of that? They've been a little bit more wary?
Well, the United States had a higher rate of inflation, has a higher rate of inflation than we have, and its inflation took off somewhat earlier than inflation in Australia. So I don't think it's very surprising that we were a bit behind the US in raising our interest rates. Central banking is not a perfect art. To say that the bank was slow to cut rates and then slow to raise rates, I think is in the nature of things. I don't think we're fundamentally any different from our peers around the world. I'm surprised that when I go overseas, and in the past I've talked to people like Paul Volcker and other people of that ilk, they've praised the Reserve Bank of Australia, saying that it is at the top of the game, and yet when you come back to Australia, you find a lot of criticism. I think there's some sort of inconsistency.
I know you've pointed out that the overall aim of inflation, that target band of 2 to 3%, has been achieved when you look at the entire period. But it is interesting to note as well that in the past few years before COVID, we were running below the inflation target. Some have said, well, if the RBA acted and got us back up to that inflation target, perhaps more people would have been employed, and there was a bit of perhaps a false aim of not getting those people employed. What do you make of that? Do we need to re-look at what full employment is in Australia as part of this review?
Well, I think, it is something that will be looked at. What is the right figure for full employment has varied over the post-Second World War period. If you look at the 1950s and 60s, full employment was considered to be less than 2%. And then by the time you get to the 1980s, full employment was considered to be around about 5%. John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, the great champion of full employment, when he considered what the figure was, he thought of full employment of around 4 to 5%, which is about what we've been having over the last 3 or 4 decades.
All right. Well, that would be one of the
central
things looked at, I'm
banking,
sure. Yeah. Go on.
No, I was just going to say the central banking. One of the key words in the history of central banking is evolution. That central banking evolves. Circumstances change, ideas change, and central banks change with those changes in circumstances and ideas. But the changes don't happen immediately. There's consideration of whether the changes are permanent or they're just very short term. So the reaction to changes in circumstances and to changes in ideas can take a period of time. And of course, these are issues that the review committee will be looking at.
We'll see where they head. Of course, we have had essentially a huge experiment with COVID in a lot of areas, including within monetary policy. Selwyn, we do appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.